The Fiddler. It was only when it was too late that Olga felt the cold ripple of fear creep up from her stomach and turn into a wave of panic. She sat down on the flower tub at the Algonquin Hotel entrance, feeling she might faint. The taxi had driven away, and it wasn't until it had disappeared around the corner that she had realized her mistake. She'd had 3 bags instead of the habitual 2, and being in such a state of exhaustion, for once she must have let her guard down and supplanted an extra bag mentally in place of her violin. Her precious Glinka Stradivarius violin of 1671, with a market value of $2.5 million, was just taking a right turn at the junction of West 44th Street and 5th Avenue for a destination unknown. That evening at the Carnegie Hall was to mark the end of the long but triumphant world tour as soloist with the World Philharmonic Youth Orchestra, and Olga had been looking forward to a long hot bath and lunch in her room with the prospect of a bit of a rest. But all this seemed so unimportant now. It was the last thing on her mind. The violin wasn't even hers, but was on loan to her from the UBS Swiss Banking Corporation. Most of the Stradivarius instruments in the world weren't owned by their players, as professional classical music musicians rarely earned enough money to be able to buy them. Certainly, it was insured for an unimaginable sum of money, but that wasn't the point. Having it lent to you was a question of honour and trust, but there was also the fact that such a wonderful instrument usually became an extension of the player's sound, their trademark, the very voice of the interpreter. Losing it would be akin to a singer opening his or her mouth and having someone else's voice come out. As the taxi swerved into 5th Avenue, it got hailed down again almost immediately. A man got in and barked a destination, and the taxi sped off, back into the busy morning's traffic. It took a right at the next block, drove for 3 blocks, took another right before the man paid the driver and alighted with a violin case, and hurriedly mingled with the crowd on the sidewalk. Olga was aware that a bellhop was standing by her side, waiting for some kind of reaction from her as to whether she would be going into the hotel or spending the night out on the pavement with her bags. He held out his white-gloved hand, and she took it gratefully, as she knew she would have difficulty standing up on her own. She went through the swing doors and across the familiar white and grey-tiled floor of the lobby to the black marble reception desk.
"Good morning and welcome, Miss Markovsky,"
said the receptionist brightly. However, immediately noticing that Olga wasn't her usual vivacious self, and having known how to read clients of all sorts at the Algonquin for the past 30 years, he lowered his voice and said,
"Is there anything I can do for you?"
Olga's first thought was to tell him of her unforgivable mistake, but she suddenly felt so ashamed that she found it impossible to confess to what was tantamount to a sin. She knew that time was of the essence, and that she should report it immediately and admit to having lost it, which is obviously the right thing to do. But it was very possible that it would get into the papers, and if that were the case, she would lose her credibility and would never be trusted with another instrument in that class again. It could mean the end of her career. She could hear the words of the insurance man in Geneva.
"Never, I repeat, never, ever let the violin out of your sight. Not for 1 nanosecond."
She was just too tired to cope. "No, thank you," she said. "I'm just feeling a little tired after traveling. Jet lag, you know." The receptionist handed her key card to the bellhop, who led the way to the lift. They went up to the 6th floor in silence, and Olga followed the little figure in the red and gold jacket to her suite. After he'd put the lights on, placed her bags on the racks, and handed her her key card, he smiled at her and left. She even forgot to give him the customary tip. A few minutes later, there was a gentle knocking on the door. It must be the bellhop again, But when Olga opened the door, it was to find another youth, a taller, lankier person, dressed in a sort of dark morning coat and grey trousers, and there was a slight whiff of... Now, what was it? Garlic! That was it, garlic! But it was not unpleasant. He was too young to be the manager, but there was something about him that brought to mind a certain class of personnel.
I am at your service, signorina. I think you may have a problem, but whatever it is, I am sure I can help.
His smile seemed to emphasize his words in such a reassuring way that Olga didn't doubt for a moment that what he said was true. She turned back into the room and collapsed on the settee, giving into uncontrollable tears. The youth stood by the door in the small entrance and waited. Olga, sensing he was still in the suite, sat up and wiped her eyes. "Are you still there?" she asked in a little voice.
Yes, signorina, I'm still here.
"I don't know what to do," she replied, starting to pace. "Please come in and sit for a moment." The youth did as he was asked, and for a while watched the elegant lady, a veritable myth in her lifetime, pacing up and down in her stockinged feet, chewing the end of a rather wet handkerchief.
"May I suggest you sit down too, signorina?"
he ventured, with a little smile. "What?" she said, suddenly looking at him as if noticing him for the first time. "Oh, yes, I'm sorry." Olga sat back on the settee and fiddled with a handkerchief in her lap. "Yes, I have a big problem," she said, letting out a sigh of temporary relief in the knowledge that she was about to share her misery with a second person, even though he was a complete stranger. She looked up at him and realized that although he was young, he had an aura about him that exuded trust and something else. His face was familiar, yet she was sure she had never met him before. His hair was jet black, long and curly, and rather lank, and his hands were beautiful, and the long fingers resting on his knees were those of an artist. He said nothing. "I am Olga Markovsky, a violinist," she announced.
"I know, signorina, I know who you are."
He smiled kindly. Then Olga proceeded to tell him what had happened. How she had got off the plane from Sydney with the violin, the arrival at the airport, the extra bag of souvenirs collected on her travels for the family, and how she had confused her third piece of luggage for the violin case when she had put both into the back seat of the taxi with her, but not taken both out when she'd left it. Exhaustion had finally caught up with her after the long voyage, and with such a demanding finale in sight. She told him that the rehearsal for tonight's performance at the Carnegie Hall was to start at 4 p.m. this afternoon, and if she couldn't get the violin back by then, her world would crumble. Sure, there was always a replacement in case of last-minute emergencies, but the people who counted would know, and she would be answerable to them in the end. "I don't want this to get into the papers. They will never trust me again with such an instrument, you see," she started to explain as if to a child. "It's a very expensive violin," she said, going back to studying the handkerchief.
"A 1671 Stradivarius, I believe,"
he said. Olga looked up at him with a start. "How do you know that?" she said.
"I am interested in violins and everything about them. Violins are very important to me."
"Why?" asked Olga.
"It is of no importance, Signorina Markovsky,"
he replied almost impatiently.
"With respect, we have a problem on our hands."
The use of the word "we" and "our" impressed and consoled Olga at the same time. "What do you think we should do?" she asked.
"Leave it to me, signorina,"
he said, standing up and suddenly looking tall and authoritative. "What is your name, my friend?" asked Olga.
"Nico, signorina,"
he said, making for the door.
"I will get back to you.
He turned around to face her.
And signorina, don't worry."
And with that he was gone, leaving Olga feeling just a tiny bit happier, but not much. Nico ran along the corridor and down the service stairs. He checked at the main desk first to see if the violin had been handed in or reported, but when the answer was no, he made a beeline for the phone booth. He phoned the yellow cab company, but the answer was as he'd expected, negative. Then he redialed another number.
"Nico,"
he said urgently when the man on the other end answered the line.
"the Glinka has gone missing."
He hurriedly explained what the situation was, and Nick, like Nico, felt the same about Olga's chances of getting the violin back. The taxi driver would have brought the violin back to the hotel the moment he discovered it, or at least would have reported it in. No, more than likely a second passenger would have got into the cab, discovered the violin, and then left with it. There were a lot of honest people in New York, but from time to time you came across one that wasn't. Nico knew. At first there had been the Tottenberg Stradivarius, which he'd found after a search of 35 years. Then there'd been the Lubinski, where, fortunately, he'd acted very quickly. And now the Glinka. Could this be the one? Would they let him take it on? There was a silence at the end of the line while Nico waited hopefully. He had waited so long for this moment.
"Okay, Nico. I will be waiting for you,"
Nick said and hung up. Nico covered the 2 blocks down to the New York Library on 42nd and 5th Avenue in record time, and with his long legs pounded up the stairs 3 at a time, past the stone lions and through the great entrance, then more stairs to the 3rd floor, and along the corridor to the map room. He looked cautiously back down the corridor once more before he quietly opened the polished wooden doors. One couldn't be seen from the main desk from this angle. He edged his way along the wall until he felt the spine of the Columbus Power of Maps book, which he touched, setting off the mechanism which silently slid the bookcase to the right, just enough to allow his slim form to slip inside before closing again without a sound. The man with the violin case ducked into an alley and opened it to see what he had managed to find, and was pretty disgusted at this old beaten-up violin that no one in their right mind would want. He plucked a string and inspected the rosin case, turning up his nose at the smell. It wasn't worth even trying to sell the thing. It would only expose him unnecessarily. He was after better things. He shut the case and left it in the alley, kicking it for good measure before rejoining the flow of people making their way towards Times Square.
"Looks like this could be your lucky day, Niccolo,"
said Big Nick, with just a little irony written on his face as Nico stood catching his breath on the other side of the big desk.
"I'll spread the word that this one's yours. But you mustn't fail. You know that, don't you?"
Nico nodded his head slowly.
"Now, if you can crack this one, the Sasru will be more than happy. And who knows? They might be willing to let you go, even if it means losing a good agent."
Nico went over to the office's blank wall and entered a code in the digital display box there. A detailed map of New York suddenly appeared, but this was no ordinary map. It had moving cars and real people walking down the busy streets. A real-time animated map projected onto the huge surface. He stood back, scrutinizing each street and avenue. Then he screwed his eyes up and held his head in his hands until the screeching high A note started. He hated the sound. It hurt him physically, but he knew it was a good sign when it came, as it would lead him to where he needed to go. Nick watched the young man, and if he'd been the praying sort, which of course he wasn't, he would have prayed that this would be the last time Nico had to go through it all again. There had been 512 surviving Stradivarius violins. Surely Nico wasn't expected to account for the few which were still missing, just because of his stupidity with the Amati. Surely this would be the one with which he could pay his debts. Nico abruptly pulled his hands away from his head and went over to the wall. He placed them flat on it and stretched the image apart to get a larger picture. There was no doubt about it. There it was! In the Times Square subway. There was no time to lose.
Off you go, Niccolo, quickly. And make sure you don't mess this one up.
He then uncharacteristically added,
And good luck.
Nico nodded to him, and then listened carefully before sliding open the door of the Stradivari and Amati Search and Rescue Organization. Once outside, he began running. He ran like he'd never run in his life, either during his 58-year lifespan of so long ago, or as the present-day 18-year-old youth who was now stuck in New York until he could pay his debts. He ran down 42nd Street for 2 blocks, then turned right and up 7th Avenue without faltering. No one in the street turned to watch this tall, dark figure as he sprinted relentlessly towards Times Square. In fact, he was invisible. He ran as if his life, or rather death, depended upon his speed. The air he breathed burned his parched throat, yet he kept running as the screeching sound of the high A became louder and began to overcome the sound of the traffic. Finally he saw the entrance to the subway and dived down the stairs into the hall where at last he slowed to walking pace and eventually stood still as the music hit him. The busy commuters hurried to and fro, and very few took any notice either of the young man dressed in the dark morning coat, or the old man in the dirty raincoat who played a violin in front of its open case, which already contained a few coins. Nico stood where he was and listened as the sound of the Capriccio number 24 echoed around the hall and past the turnstiles and down into the bowels of the New York subway system. The old man played with his eyes shut. His fingers flew over the strings with ease, and Nico wondered if he would have been able to play with such ease had he reached this advanced age. As the old man started the pizzicato passage of variation number 9, he opened his eyes, and his gaze locked with Nico's. His fingers hardly faltered, but his heart skipped a beat as he went into the more delicate variation number 10. He realized that the inevitable was about to happen. He took the 11th and the finale with even more attention and passion. When he came to the end, he closed his eyes, relaxed his grip a little, and let his head hang down in a mixture of reluctance and ecstasy. Nico went over to him. The old man took the violin away from his chin and transferred the bow from his right hand to his left, and wiped a tear from his eye. He knew what Nico was there for and why he had come.
I knew it couldn't last for long,
he said.
Only a question of time. I can only be grateful that I had the chance to play it.
Nico smiled at him and touched his hand. The old man looked up at the tall stranger and knew that a miracle had happened.
I found it, you know. I didn't steal it. I know,
replied Nico gently.
It is time,
he said, and the old man collected the coins and put the violin back in the case.
Don't be sad, my friend,
added Nico.
I'm not,
assured the old man, handing the violin to Nico.
How many people have a chance to play an instrument like this in their lives?
He reached behind him and took his own violin from its case. The two men looked at each other. No more words were needed. The old boy nestled his violin under his chin and began to play again. Nico couldn't leave him like this. He looked at his watch. There was time. He took the Stradivarius from the case and tucked it underneath his own chin, and joined the old man in what was to be a unique performance, only appreciated by the two men, although some passers-by stopped in their tracks for a moment to look at a solitary old man playing exceptionally well. So well, in fact, that it sounded like two violins. When the music came to an end, the two men smiled knowingly at each other, and with the next crowd of hurrying commuters, the tall youth with the violin had disappeared. Olga Markovsky could no longer put off leaving the Algonquin. She would be late for the last rehearsal before the concert. Her evening gown and shoes were packed and ready to go, but she felt cold and miserable, physically sick. She'd hung on until the last moment before leaving her room in the hope that Nico had been as good as his word, but it looked like he hadn't been, and she felt wretched as she got ready to go. How could she have been so stupid and misguided? She should have contacted the authorities immediately. Suddenly, there was a gentle tapping on the door, and when she opened it, the bellhop stood there with the violin in one hand and an envelope in the other.
"These were left for you at the desk, Miss Markovsky,"
he said. Olga's heart swelled with joy, and she rushed to her bag and took out a $50 bill and handed it to the young man.
"This is too much, miss,"
he said reluctantly, hoping she hadn't made a mistake. "No, my friend, it can never be enough," she laughed, and taking the precious case and the envelope, closed the door on the delighted boy's face. She rushed to the table and opened the case. There it was, intact, all present and correct. She opened the envelope and sat down to read the letter inside. The hand was in a swirling cursive lettering. Her hands shook as she read.
Dear Miss Markovsky, I'm sorry if I have taken a little longer than expected to return your violin to your safe keeping, so please allow me to apologize for any extra anxiety this may have occasioned you. I feel I owe you an explanation. I am sure that you know the violin maker Antonio Stradivari was an apprentice of Niccolo Amati, so you can certainly appreciate what I am about to tell you. Many, many years ago, when I was 18, I was given an Amati violin. The man who gave it to me said that it came with a warning. Should anything happen to it, I would not rest until I had made amends.
I was young and stupid, and at that time had become a terrible gambler. To cut a long story short, I ran out of money and gambled my Amati violin and lost. At the end of my life I fell ill, and it was then that I remembered the Amati warning. A priest was sent for me, but I felt that the moment had not come. However, I died suddenly before I could speak to another priest, and never managed to declare my sins and my repentance. As you know, it was widely rumored that I had an association with the devil. This fact was judged as being true by the higher court. So, as a penance, it has been my task to recuperate a set of number of lost or stolen Stradivari or Amati violins, until I have gained, if not my entry into heaven, at least my sortie from this hell that I have been living for 175 years. Thanks to your unfortunate experience and my positive solution to it, I have finally been liberated from my assignment and can now rest in peace. We will not meet again, Miss Markovsky, but I know that your rendition of my violin concerto number 6 tonight will be an overwhelming success. I remain your servant, Niccolo Paganini.